One of the biggest mysteries in United States history, and probably the one most speculated about, is the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In light of the recent release of JFK assassination records today, we're going to share some perspectives on that momentous and tragic event. Welcome to the Coleman Nation. John F. Kennedy was our 35th president. He was greatly beloved throughout the nation, and his assassination on November 22nd, 1963 came as a terrible shock. A friend of mine who was a child at the time recalls his father bursting into tears when the news came over the radio. It was an absolute tragedy. Another close friend of mine, a buddy of mine named Mark Arnold, has done some considerable research on the JFK assassination and recently shared some of his perspectives with me, via social media. As I really want to make sure that I'm giving him credit for some of the stuff. It was more of like, an assessment of his online article, which I thought was very, very well thought out and very insightful. So I wanted to kind of share that with you. So first, the barest of research will determine that there was indeed some kind of conspiracy. The assassination was famously filmed by Abraham Zapruder, who with an 8mm camera was filming the parade for posterity and just happened to film the assassination itself. Some serious effort was made to suppress the film, but it was finally released. All one has to do is watch it to know there was a conspiracy. The fatal bullet struck Kennedy in the head, shoving his body backward and to the left. This would indicate backward to the left, backward to the left. You've heard that a million times before. This would indicate that the shot came from a completely different direction than that of the supposed lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, in the Texas Book Depository, which was behind the motorcade. That Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone has been the official stance since that time, and the filmed evidence shows obviously that to be a lie. That being the case, the next logical question becomes, why did people conspire to kill him? And I think that this is the bigger question that people wanted to have answered. Why not use his many sexual indiscretions to discredit him and force him to resign? Right? One such indiscretion was the girlfriend of Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana. Now, this is going to be interesting and come into play here in a little bit. We'll talk about that in a second. But that alone would have given someone the public relations ammunition to discredit JFK right off the bat. So my friend Mark finally concluded that Kennedy's enemies within the CIA and the military, along with notorious FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and even Kennedy's Vice President Lyndon Johnson, had so many indiscretions of their own that they would have been equally and easily discredited if they had revealed JFK's infidelities as well. So JFK and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, knew full well about their enemies' indiscretions, and it was almost as if they had blackmail on each other. It was a mutually assured destruction through blackmail that they decided to counterbalance all of these, sort of things that they didn't want to come out in the public eye. Absolutely crazy. So one possible explanation for the assassination is that someone was setting an example for future presidents. JFK intended to wield control over this concept of the deep state, which is defined as a body of people, typically influential members of government agencies or the military, believed to be involved in the secret manipulation of government policy. The assassination would make anyone following in Kennedy's footsteps think twice about challenging the military-industrial complex, the combined power of the military and their corporate suppliers and others of that kind. Then there are others who point to the Mafia. The Mafia hated JFK because of the attack on them by the Attorney General, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy. And there is a theory that the Mafia actually won the very close election for JFK against Richard Nixon at that time, and assassinating him was their revenge for the Attorney General's attack on them. So my friend Mark, he did not believe that the mafia orchestrated the assassination simply because there were too many factors beyond their control to make this happen. Today's sponsor is No Tox Life. No Tox Life personal care products, they're awesome. So if you're looking to cut down on harmful chemicals in your daily routine, that's where me and my family, we made the switch to No Tox Life, today's sponsor of the show. From personal care to home essentials, No Tox Life makes products that are not only safe and non-toxic, but are also eco-friendly and genuinely effective. Everything, we're talking dishwashing bars to their detoxifying facial cleansers. These things are amazing, right? Their lip balms. Look at these great lip balms, Vanilla Cloud and Sweet Mint. Great for your lips. Excellent product. And then my personal favorite, they're all natural deodorants. You've got, their aloe. If you want to be able to have, sort of that light scent of aloe, then you've got Earl Grey. That's totally amazing. If you want something a little more, on the feminine side, the rose. These are just amazing products. So I've seen what goes into mainstream products, and let me tell you, some of that stuff is very, very scary. But No Tox Life, it's clean, vegan, smells amazing, and actually works. So we use their products every day, and I can say sincerely that this is a product and a brand that we love and we trust. So if you're ready to start living a life with less toxic exposure, head over to notoxlife.com and use the code Coleman Nation, all one word, Coleman Nation at checkout for 20% off your next order. Are you kidding? 20% off? That's huge. So that's notoxlife.com. Live cleaner, live better with No Tox Life. Now, let's get back to our episode. So why was JFK killed? So here's the theory. JFK's presidency was at the height of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, in which each country built up its nuclear arsenal as a constant threat to the other. Two things about JFK politically set him apart from the standard Cold Warrior mentality of the day. The first factor that set him apart was his anti-colonial stance, which meant he strongly opposed nations that had dominated other countries by colonizing them. If you examine his writings and speeches, first as a congressman and later as a senator, this attitude can clearly be seen. He was especially critical of France for its domination of Vietnam and later for its handling of the French North African colony of Algeria. Kennedy's views in this regard were in stark contrast to the Cold War views held by most U.S. politicians at the time, as well as the military and the CIA. To understand their views, you should first understand what NATO is. Now, you've heard of it. You probably researched it, Wikipedia, all that kind of stuff. But NATO is short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance of 32 countries and North America, the purpose of which is to protect its member countries through political and military means. For the Cold War-minded folks, anti-communism and the maintenance of NATO had priority over anything else, including colonialism. At the time, many emerging third world countries struggled to throw off the chains of colonialism, especially in Africa and Asia. Vietnam and Algeria were two of these nations. Elsewhere, Indonesia was trying to get out from under the Dutch. The Congo in Africa was trying to get free from Belgium, and there were many others that were falling into these categories of this anti-colonialism at this time. Because communism was viewed as a big threat, and NATO, which included colonial powers such as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, was the primary protection against communism in Europe, the U.S. ended up supporting colonial powers against independence movements emerging in their colonies. JFK felt that such support was a huge mistake in foreign policy. By supporting European colonial masters instead of those being suppressed by the colonies, the U.S. was allowing the Soviet Union to move in and ally itself with the largely suppressed peoples in European colonies, which it did. Instead of protecting against communism, this policy actually opened the door to it. So the second important thing to grasp about JFK, which also set him at odds with the military-industrial complex, was his willingness to negotiate. He was always willing to negotiate. In his inaugural address, he said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. He was acutely aware that the days of all-out conflict, as had occurred in both world wars, were over in the nuclear age. That was done. The next quote-unquote all-out war would destroy civilization and everyone in it. These are things that we are facing right now, by the way. And this is why this is very, very important to sort of review, because we've all heard that term that history repeats itself, but we're literally seeing that right now. So JFK felt that, avoiding this sort of conflict, that was his primary consideration. If he could negotiate to solve problems, he always would, right? And I think that negotiation has to be one of the things that's on the table out of the gate. Okay. I've got my own opinions about Ukraine and all that kind of stuff, but I'm just telling you this right now. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Negotiation should have been the first thing. So if you look at his handling of these crises as he faced, these during his first 1,000 days in office, they clearly demonstrate this stance. The chief example was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a 13-day standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the Soviet Union's deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba, right at America's back door. We were on the brink of nuclear war. The military at the time favored direct conflict in such situations, and Kennedy always circumvented conflict through negotiation. He was actually aware of not creating circumstances that would back an opponent, primarily the Soviets, into a place where they considered war their only option. JFK manifested this skill many times. Lastly, Kennedy was aware that the U.S. itself was exerting a form of colonialism through economic domination of third world nations by American corporations, primarily in Latin America. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA protected such interests in lesser developed nations. If a regime in one of these countries attempted to block a corporation, which happened in several instances, the CIA was turned to as the means to eliminate the problem. The CIA would then make it look like a head of state being removed was secretly communist or otherwise bad for the nation. To accomplish this, the CIA engaged in election interference, black propaganda campaigns, inciting and equipping revolutions, and even assassinations. One example is Jacobo Arbenz, president of Guatemala in the early 1950s. Arbenz's farming policies ran against the United Fruit Company, an American corporation operating there. The United Fruit Company lobbied the U.S. government, and the CIA and U.S. State Department engineered a coup that ousted Arbenz in 1954. If you've ever wondered why the U.S. became so hated and distrusted around the world, these kinds of actions are a large part of the answer. Taking all of the above reasoning into account, my friend Mark, he poses the question, is it really so remarkable to think that these same intelligence capabilities could be turned against a president who opposed the above described operations? Not only that, but one who was determined to end the Vietnam War and who was pursuing eased relations with the Soviet Union? This is not remarkable. And this is very, very obvious stuff. So the belief here is that that's exactly what happened. But what do you think of this analysis? Do you have a different theory of what was behind the JFK assassination? Right? Leave a comment and let me know. I think this is very, very interesting stuff because right now we get an opportunity to see some of the puzzle pieces. And I really created this episode to kind of help navigate some of the thoughts. This is old information and some of these puzzle pieces and some of the data that's coming out, that's being released is shedding some light on, some of the interactions that were happening at the time. And so I wanted to take this, which I read, from a social media post by my friend, give him credit for it, but also give us some thought, insight, and backstory as to why the JFK assassination was always a mystery for people, why it was so important to bring some of these things to light, even though many of the actors, if not all of them, have since been deceased, right? But are some of these things happening right now? I don't know. These are some of the questions that we have to ask. Are there forces that are mobilized in order to be able to create more power? Obviously, I think that that's the case. But are some of these forces that are frankly above all all of our pay grade? Are they making decisions about society that have effects on us, at sort of the broad civilizational aspect? I think that that's the case. And I think that it should be something that we're aware of. It's something that we should be thinking about. And it's something that we should use the elections that we have, not only within our country, but in countries abroad, to be able to take a stand against this stuff and make sure that we are creating an environment of freedom and freedom of choice and freedom of thought. So if you enjoyed this episode and found it informative, please like it and subscribe. Make sure that you click notifications so you know when we post new content, and make sure that you interact with us and follow us on all of our social medias and all the podcast platforms that are out there. All right, try saying that 10 times fast. Podcast platforms. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Coleman Nation. Take care.